What's going on, y'all? AttorneyTom here with another USCSB React video. Today's video is titled Blocked In, which is a kind of vague title, so I don't know what industry we're going to be talking about. So let's jump right into it.
June 13th, 2013. The Williams-Geismar Olefins plant in Geismar, Louisiana. A heat exchanger violently ruptured, causing an explosion and fire that killed 2 workers. The Chemical Safety Board launched an investigation and issued a case study. In it, the agency describes a number of process safety management program deficiencies at Williams, which set the stage for the incident. In particular, the CSB found that the heat exchanger that failed was completely isolated from its pressure relief valve. When pressure inside the heat exchanger dangerously increased, there was nothing to stop a catastrophic rupture.
So remember, when things like this happen, there's often more than one thing that goes wrong. Initially, the very first problem that they brought up was the lack of access to a pressure release valve. So immediately that's maybe some sort of design defect, right? The plant was just literally negligently designed. They didn't have access to an overpressurization. But when things like this happen, generally there are multiple things that go wrong that all culminate in a catastrophe. So right from the beginning, the USCSB lets us know these are the issues at play. The overpressure protection is the potential design defect that we were talking about. And in the real world, when this gets brought up, what happens is the defendants just point the finger at everybody else. The entity who designed the pressure system says, well, our pressure system was fine, but it was the hierarchy of control that mismanaged the workers, which caused the explosion. And then the management says, no, it wasn't our culture, or it wasn't how we managed our employees. It was the design. And they do this because nobody wants to take responsibility for the workers who they killed.
Our case study on the explosion at Williams describes an ineffective process safety management program at the plant at the time of the incident. We urge other companies to learn from our investigation, to incorporate our recommendations at their facilities, and to assess the current state of their process safety culture so that a similar accident can be averted.
The Williams-Geismar Olefins plant is located in Geismar, Louisiana. The plant produces ethylene and propylene. These are chemicals used in the petrochemical industry to make a variety of products, including plastics and antifreeze. Within the Williams process is a distillation column called the propylene fractionator. It separates a mixture of propane and propylene. Heat exchangers called reboilers supply heat to the fractionator to boil the propane and propylene mixture, which is essential to the separation process. The reboilers are shell and tube heat exchangers. Hot water flows through the tubes, heating and vaporizing propane that flows through the shell and back to the propylene fractionator. The water that flows through the tubes contains a small amount of oily tar, which condenses into the water earlier in the process. Over time, the oily tar from the water builds up on the walls of the reboiler tubes. This buildup is called fouling. Fouling reduces the efficiency of the reboilers. Periodically, the reboilers must be shut down to clean the tubes. The original propylene fractionator design had both reboilers running simultaneously, but in that configuration, the fractionator had to be shut down when a reboiler fouled and needed cleaning. To prevent shutdown of the propylene fractionator each time the reboilers needed to be cleaned, in 2001, new valves were installed on each reboiler to allow for operation of only one at a time. The other reboiler is on standby, clean and ready for use. But unforeseen at the time, these valves introduced a serious hazard. They isolated the standby reboiler from its protective pressure relief valve, located on top of the fractionator.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so it's going to depend on the entities who were in charge of designing this. But if the entity who installed the valve is different than the entity who designed the system, Well, obviously the original entity is going to say, listen, we designed a safe system, but when you introduced this valve, it blocked our system. So we're not the ones who are responsible. It is the individual or entity who put in the valve because you made the system unsafe just because you didn't want to shut down the plant temporarily while you cleaned the system. Profits over safety. And in the real world, when we have to work on these kind of cases, and I work on refinery explosion cases, it is very difficult to discover who was in charge of design, who was in charge of upkeep, who was in charge of maintenance. All of these things are important. And like I said, it's a big cluster. Everybody's pointing the finger at each other. Sometimes information is not disclosed. It's a headache.
On June 13th, 2013, during a daily meeting with operations and maintenance personnel, the Williams plant manager noticed that the water flow rate through the operating reboiler had dropped gradually over the past day. The operations supervisor informed the group he would try to identify the problem. He went into the plant to evaluate the water flow rates. The operations supervisor informed several personnel that fouling within the operating reboiler could be the problem, and they might need to switch the reboilers. He attempted to meet with his manager so they could get the necessary maintenance and operations personnel involved who would perform the work. But his manager was not available. The operations supervisor returned to the field. The CSB determined that at 8:33 a.m., the operations supervisor likely opened the water valves on the standby reboiler. Hot water began flowing inside. The valves blocking the reboiler from its protective pressure relief valve remained closed. But unknown to the operations supervisor, the standby reboiler contained flammable liquid propane that had accumulated during the 16 months the reboiler was out of service. The hot water quickly heated the liquid propane confined inside of the reboiler, and pressure dangerously increased. Just 3 minutes later, the reboiler violently ruptured. Propane exploded from the reboiler and ignited to create a massive fireball.
So now we've introduced a chain of command issue and potentially a failure of maintenance of the plant. They said this propane was in this tank for 18 months or 16 months, which again is maybe not outcome determinative, but it's all these little things that stack up. Additionally, the field operator could not find his manager. Where was the manager? Why couldn't he reach the manager? Why couldn't the plant manager be available for some sort of consultation? And then why would the operator, without the approval of the plant manager, go out there and begin this switch to begin with? So clearly there are some issues with safety hierarchy, with chain of command, with the culture. Why did this individual think it was okay to do this without the approval of his supervisors? As you can see, all these mistakes are just stacking on top of each other, and they result in a catastrophe.
The explosion killed the operations supervisor and an operator working nearby. 167 Williams employees and contractors reported being injured. During its investigation, the CSB found that prior to the explosion, the standby reboiler had been out of service for over a year, isolated from the process by closed block valves. But during this 16-month period, liquid propane unintentionally entered the shell of the reboiler, perhaps through a mistakenly opened valve or a leaking block valve. The CSB determined that when the operations supervisor opened the hot water valves to the standby reboiler, the propane liquid trapped inside was heated and expanded in volume to completely fill the reboiler shell. This caused pressure to dramatically increase until the reboiler ruptured.
When identifying overpressure protection requirements for heat exchangers, engineers should evaluate the scenario that caused the Williams explosion. The hot side of the heat exchanger was operated while the cold side was blocked in. In this scenario, just having a pressure relief valve available could have prevented the explosion.
The CSB discovered that in the 12 years leading to the incident, a series of process safety management program deficiencies caused the reboiler to be unprotected from overpressure.
So now we're getting into safety management program deficiencies. None of this happens overnight. This was a slow and steady decline in the safety of the refinery. Have y'all ever been on a job or have done something where you do something really, really meticulously the first time, but then you get comfortable and you kind of cut corners? This is the same type of thing. But the problem is, when you are dealing with something that is so extremely dangerous, you cannot afford to cut corners or do things that might jeopardize safety. And that ultimately falls on management. They need a culture where it is not acceptable to cut corners. And I know a lot of these guys who are workers in refineries. I've represented a lot of them. They're great people. And I hear the jokes about unnecessary safety and XYZ, but the reality is it's there for a reason. Because once a process stops being done, the next guy who inherits the job is not going to know about it, and so on and so forth. And next thing you know, you have a tank that hasn't been cleaned or touched in 18 months that is unintentionally filled with propane, and it explodes.
Caused the reboiler to be unprotected from overpressure. When Williams installed the process block valves on the reboilers in 2001...
So Williams is the one who installed the blocker. That's the owner of the refinery. So it wasn't an outside third party.
Performed a management of change review to identify how this action affected the safety of the process. The CSB found, however, that Williams did not identify that the new valves could isolate the reboilers from their protective pressure relief valve. Companies are required to conduct a management of change review before making equipment changes, so they may consider the impact of that change on the safety of the process. But the CSB discovered that Williams conducted the management of change review after the process was already operating with the new valves.
We concluded that Williams conducted the delayed management of change to meet regulatory requirements at that point, rather than to use it as a tool to identify and control new process hazards.
That's a great sentence. Okay. She said that they made this change to meet regulatory requirements at that time. So what is Williams going to say? Williams is going to say, hey, we were meeting regulatory requirements, therefore we are not liable. Guess what? Just because you technically meet regulatory requirements does not excuse you from negligence. And I know that might upset a lot of the keyboard warriors out there, but it's true. They failed to do a proper analysis before they made the change. And just because their failure to isolate the overpressurization valve was not identified at the time that they made those changes does not mean that they somehow get a pass.
That was a serious missed opportunity to identify the new overpressure hazard that was introduced to the process by the new valves.
After the 2001 reboiler valve installation, Williams also performed a pre-startup safety review, as required by regulations. But the CSB found that Williams reviewers did not respond to key process safety questions on the form. One of those questions asked, are pressure relief systems in place and operational? That answer was left blank.
Williams, come on. Now you're getting into the territory of maybe you knew, or if you didn't know, you should have known by failing to answer applicable questions. If I were the lawyer in this case, this is the type of evidence that is a multiplier. This just makes the incident so much worse because it shows that they knew or should have known that there was danger, yet they failed to take any action. I hate the word accident. I truly don't believe in the word accident on a refinery. There are never accidents. Everything is preventable.
Even though the pre-startup safety review document was incomplete and there were questions that were not answered, management approved the form. And the end result was these reboilers were put into service without adequate overpressure protection.
Okay, that's all I need to see, because Williams was not only the refinery owner and operator in charge of personnel and safety measures on the refinery, but also because they were the entity in charge of installing the valves and creating the system that blew up. They're 100% at fault. 100% at fault. in my opinion. But I want y'all to let me know what you think down below. All right, y'all, that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. My goal is always to make content worthy of your time. Even though these videos aren't particularly funny or exciting, I think they are educational and they do provide value. Thank you so much for watching. Talk to you later. Bye.
He's a catastrophic injury attorney who accidentally became a YouTuber. Attorney Tom.